The morning Naomi Brooks decided to leave the Arizona territory forever, the sky was the color of a bruise healing over a wound that had never quite closed. She stood at the window of the small adobe house she had called home for 3 years, watching the sun drag itself up over the Superstition Mountains, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. Her trunk sat open on the floor behind her, half filled with the sum total of a life she was choosing to abandon. A worn quilt her mother had stitched by lamplight back in Missouri, a Bible with a cracked spine, 2 cotton dresses, a wool skirt, and a pair of boots that had walked more miles of hard earth than she cared to count. She was 26 years old, she was a widow, and she was done. 3 years ago she had followed her husband, Thomas Brooks, out to the territory with a heart full of hope and a head full of the stories men like him always told. Stories about land and freedom and the kind of fresh start that only the wide-open West could offer. Thomas had been a dreamer, and she had loved that about him, loved it fiercely and completely, right up until the moment that dreaming turned to recklessness and recklessness got him killed in a dispute over water rights he had no legal claim to. The men who shot him were never held accountable. The law in Caldwell Flats was a loose and forgiving thing, particularly when the men in question had money and the man who died did not. She had stayed on after his death longer than she should have. Pride partly, stubbornness mostly. She had taken in laundry and mending, had sold eggs from the small flock of hens she kept behind the house, had scraped together a living that was dignified if not comfortable. But the town of Caldwell Flats had a way of grinding a woman down slowly, the way wind grinds sandstone, until the edges were smooth and the original shape was lost entirely. She could feel herself being worn away. The letter from her sister Ruth in San Francisco had arrived 2 weeks ago, and Naomi had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Ruth had married well, a merchant named Philip Crane who dealt in dry goods and had done enough business in the California trade to build something real and lasting. Ruth wrote that there was room for Naomi, that there was work she could do helping Philip manage the accounts, that San Francisco was a city where a woman with intelligence and determination could find a life worth living. Come home, Ruth had written, even though San Francisco had never been home for either of them. Come to something better. Naomi had made her decision quietly, the way she made all her important decisions, without fanfare or announcement. She had paid what remained of her debts at the general store and at the feed merchant who had extended her credit for the hens' grain. She had sold the hens themselves to her neighbor, Mrs. Clara Whitfield, who had admired them for years. She had given notice to the 3 families whose laundry she took in. She had booked a seat on the twice-weekly stagecoach that ran west toward the rail junction at Maricopa Wells, from which she could connect to the Southern Pacific line that would carry her eventually to California. The stage left on Friday morning. Today was Wednesday. She had 2 days left in the only place she had truly lived as an adult woman, and she found that she felt almost nothing about leaving it except a dull and abiding relief. She pulled herself away from the window and went to the small iron stove to heat water for coffee. As she moved through the familiar motions of her morning, she listened to the sounds of Caldwell Flats waking up around her. The creak and clatter of a wagon on the main street, a dog barking somewhere to the east. The distant rhythm of hammering from the new building that Hector Voss, the town's most prosperous cattle broker, was putting up on the corner near the bank. The town was growing, always growing, swallowing more desert and pushing its dusty streets a little further in every direction, and none of it had anything to do with her anymore. She was pouring her coffee when she heard the knock at her door. Edwin Yates stood on her front step with his hat in his hands and the morning sun making a long shadow of him across her threshold. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who worked cattle in the Arizona sun were weathered, with dark hair gone a little long at the collar, and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm rolls in, That particular shade of gray-blue that could look either gentle or fierce depending on the light and his mood. He had worked as a ranch hand and later as a foreman for a spread north of town called the Rocking K, which was owned by a man named George Kellerman, who was neither good nor bad but somewhere in the complicated middle of both. Naomi had known Edwin Yates for the better part of a year, which was long enough to understand that he was the kind of man who said what he meant and meant what he said, a quality that was rarer in Caldwell Flats than clean water. He had first come to her attention when he had intervened on her behalf at the general store, talking down a drunk cowhand who had been blocking her exit and making unpleasant comments about a widow woman shopping alone. Edwin had not drawn his gun or thrown a punch. He had simply put himself between her and the problem, and spoken in a voice so calm and so certain that the cowhand had moved without being entirely sure why. Afterward, he had carried her purchases to her door and tipped his hat and left, and she had thought about the steadiness of him for longer than she was entirely comfortable admitting. They had fallen into a kind of careful friendship after that. He came by on Sunday afternoons sometimes, and she would give him coffee, and they would sit on her small porch and talk about things that mattered and things that did not. He had told her about growing up in Tennessee, about his father's farm and his two older brothers, and the way he had drifted west at 19 because the land at home was too small for all three of them, and he had always suspected the world was bigger than his county. She had told him about Missouri and her mother's quilt, and the way Thomas had looked when he first described Arizona, like a man who had seen a promised land in a dream and could not rest until he reached it. What she had not told Edwin was what she felt when he sat across from her in the afternoon light, that slow warmth that she had been actively suppressing for months because she was a practical woman who understood the difference between loneliness and love and was determined not to confuse the two. She was leaving anyway, she had told herself. It did not matter what she felt. Now he stood on her doorstep and looked at her with those storm-colored eyes and said, "I heard you might be going." She stepped back to let him in, because she had been raised with manners, and she was not about to abandon them in the last days of her residence in this place. "Word travels fast," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield told me about the hens." He set his hat on the edge of her table and looked at the open trunk on the floor and the cleared shelves and the general air of a life being systematically dismantled. "I came to see if it was true." "It is true," she said. "I am leaving on Friday, on the stage to Maricopa Wells." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, someone called out to someone else about a loose mule, and the sound of it drifted through the window and faded. "Where are you going after that?" he asked. "San Francisco. My sister is there. She has a good life and she wants me to share it." She said this in the even, practical tone she used when she had already made a decision and was no longer interested in arguing about it. "I should have gone sooner. I stayed too long already." He pulled out a chair from the table and sat down, without being invited, which she noted but did not object to. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together, and he looked at the floor for a moment as if it contained information he needed. Then he looked up at her. "Naomi," he said, and the use of her first name, which he did sparingly, made her pay attention in a way that the conversation had not quite required of her yet. "I am not going to try to talk you out of going. I know better than to try to talk you out of anything, but I want you to know something before you go." She waited. "I have been sitting with something for a good while now," he said, "and I have not said it because I did not know what right I had to say it. But if you are leaving on Friday, then I am running out of time to figure out the right moment, and I think the right moment might just be now." He paused. "I care about you, more than I have ever let on, more than I have a good explanation for if I am being honest. And I think if I let you get on that stage without saying so, I am going to be the biggest fool in the Arizona territory." The warmth she had been suppressing all these months rose up in her chest like water finding the level it was always meant to find. She looked at him sitting in her kitchen with the open trunk on the floor between them and the 2 days of her remaining life in this place already ticking away, and she felt the full weight of the impossible timing of it, how a person could spend months carefully not feeling something only to have it become unavoidable at exactly the wrong moment. "Edwin," she said, "I am not asking you to stay," he said quickly, before she could form her objection. "I know this place has not been kind to you. I know what it took from you, and I know how long you have held on waiting for something to get better, and I am not going to be the man who asks you to keep waiting." He stood up, unfolding his tall frame from the chair, and he looked at her with something in his expression that she could not quite name except that it was honest and it was real, and it asked nothing of her that she was not willing to give. "I just wanted you to know. That is all." She looked at him standing in her kitchen, and she thought about the afternoon light and the Sunday coffees and the way he had stood between her and a problem without making a production of it. And she thought about San Francisco and Ruth's letter and the clean slate of a future she had not yet written. She thought about all of these things at once, and then she said something that surprised her almost as much as it surprised him. "Then come with me." He blinked. It was the only indication that she had caught him off guard. "I am leaving the territory for good," she said, and she heard her own voice steadying as she spoke, the way a person finds their footing on uncertain ground. "I have made up my mind about that, and I am not changing it, but I did not say I was leaving alone." For a moment he simply looked at her, as if he was translating what she had said into a language he could fully understand. Then something shifted in his expression, some resolution reaching the other side of a calculation he had been running since the moment he knocked on her door. "Then I am coming with you," he said. And just like that, the shape of everything changed. The next 2 days were a controlled chaos of the very specific kind that comes when a person who planned to leave alone suddenly has a partner in the leaving. Edwin rode back to the rocking quay that same morning and had a conversation with George Kellerman that lasted the better part of 2 hours, and which Edwin reported to her afterward in characteristically economical terms. George had not been pleased, but he had been fair. He had paid Edwin his wages through the end of the month, shaken his hand, and told him he was a damned fool in the affectionate way that men who respect each other use that particular insult. Edwin had come back to Caldwell Flats with his back wages in his pocket, and his horse saddled for a longer journey than the road to the rocking quay. His belongings, when he assembled them, were not much more than hers: a bedroll and a canvas bag with his spare clothes, a good rifle, and the Colt revolver he wore at his hip, as naturally as other men wore their Sunday jackets. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Calhoun, who had been his constant companion for 7 years, and who regarded the world with the stoic patience of an animal that has seen most of what it has to offer and is no longer surprised by any of it. A small leather pouch of money that he had saved with no particular purpose in mind, which now had a purpose. They made their practical arrangements with the brisk efficiency of 2 people who are slightly embarrassed by the enormity of what they have decided to do, and are covering that embarrassment with competence. She booked a second seat on the stage. He arranged for Calhoun to be transported separately, loading the horse with the freight wagon that made the same route. They sorted through what could be carried and what must be sold or left behind, and in the process of doing this, they worked side by side in her small house for 2 full days in a proximity that was new and charged with the awareness of what they had said to each other and what they had agreed to, and what, between the words and the agreement, remained yet unsaid. On Thursday evening, the evening before the stage left, they sat together on her porch for what would be the last time in the place that had been her home. The sun went down in spectacular fashion, the way Arizona sunsets always did, as if the sky was making an argument for its own beauty and pulling out every available color to make the case. Red and gold and deep orange, and, at the very edges, a purple so rich it looked painted. Naomi sat with her hands folded in her lap, and Edwin sat beside her in the other chair, and they watched the sun go down together without speaking for a long time. "Are you frightened?" he asked her after a while. "No," she said, And then because she was also an honest woman, yes, a little, of San Francisco, of starting over, she turned to look at him in the fading light. The last time I started over, I did it believing that the person I was with had all the answers. Thomas was so certain about everything. I did not realize until too late that certainty is not the same as being right. Edwin nodded slowly. I do not have all the answers, he said. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I know, she said. That is actually one of the things I like about you. The corner of his mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was heading in that direction. A man is appreciated for his ignorance. That is new. It is not the ignorance, she said. It is the honesty about it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I want to say something else, and I want to say it now while we are still here, because once we get on that stage tomorrow, everything is going to be different, and I do not know if I will find the right words in a different place. Then say it here, she said. He turned to look at her fully, and in the last of the sunset light his eyes were very blue and very steady and very much the eyes of a man who has made up his mind completely. I am not coming with you because I have nothing left here, he said. I am coming with you because you are who I want to be where. Because I have spent the better part of a year sitting on this porch on Sunday afternoons and talking about everything except the thing I should have been saying, which is that you are the best person I know. Not just the best woman, the best person. And I do not want to find out what my life looks like without you in it. Naomi felt the truth of it land somewhere behind her sternum with the quiet, permanent weight of something that would not be moved. She had spent 3 years being practical and careful and guarded, and she felt all of that very carefully constructed protection dissolving at its seams, not violently or all at once, but steadily, the way morning frost dissolves when the sun gets high enough. Edwin, she said, and her voice was softer than she intended it to be. You do not have to say anything back, he said. Not tonight. There is time. We are getting on a stagecoach tomorrow, she said, and after that a train, and we are going to California together. There is time, yes, but there is also now. She looked at him steadily. I am frightened of starting over, she said again. But when I think about starting over with you, I am less frightened, considerably less frightened. That is the most honest thing I know how to say tonight. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him. And they sat like that while the last of the light bled out of the Arizona sky and the desert went dark around them, and the stars came out one by one over the Superstition Mountains. And it felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something beginning instead of ending. The stagecoach left Caldwell Flats at 7 in the morning, with 6 passengers packed into its rocking interior. Naomi and Edwin sat across from each other, because the bench seating did not allow for side-by-side arrangements. And so they spent the first hours of their journey looking at each other across the knees of a round-faced merchant named Aldous Pritchard who smelled of bay rum, and talked about his dry goods business in Tucson, with the enthusiasm of a man who has found in commerce what others find in religion. The other passengers were a young couple who appeared to be recently married, judging by their brand-new clothes and their inability to stop touching each other's hands, and a woman of about 50, in a severe gray dress, who introduced herself as Mrs. Agnes Beaumont, and who spent the journey reading a well-worn copy of Psalms and looking out the window with an expression of deep satisfaction, as if the desert was confirming something she had always suspected. The road to Maricopa Wells was not a comfortable road. The stagecoach jolted and swayed over ground that had been hardened by the summer heat into a series of ruts and corrugations that transferred every irregularity of the terrain directly into the spines of the passengers. Naomi had brought a folded shawl to use as a cushion, and she pressed it firmly against the wooden seat and concentrated on the scenery and tried to think of herself as a person on an adventure rather than a person being shaken loose from her own skeleton. They stopped twice to rest the horses and let the passengers stretch their legs. At the first stop, a place called Broken Rock Station, where a weather-beaten building offered water and shade and nothing much else. Naomi stood in the shadow of the station wall and looked back east at the direction they had come from. The desert stretched away flat and vast and enormously indifferent, and Caldwell Flats was already invisible below the horizon, swallowed by distance and dust. She felt the strangeness of that, how completely and quickly a place that had held 3 years of her life had disappeared from view. Edwin came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her arm. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. "No," she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it completely. "You?" "Not a single one." He looked out at the eastern desert with her. "Though I will say this country looks different when you are leaving it than it did when you were in the middle of it." "How so?" "When you are in it, it just looks like where you are. When you are leaving it, you start to see the shape of it." He tilted his head slightly. "It is a harsh place, beautiful but harsh." "It is," she agreed. Thomas thought it was paradise. He saw the mountains and the sky and the space, and he never quite saw the harshness of it. She paused. "I saw both, I think, from the beginning, but I loved him, so I came anyway." Edwin said nothing to that, which was the right thing to say. He understood, she thought, the difference between a statement that wants a response and a statement that just wants to be spoken out loud. They got back on the coach and continued west. By late afternoon, they reached Maricopa Wells, which was less a town than a cluster of buildings around the stage station, though it had grown considerably since the railroad had come through. The Southern Pacific Line ran through here, connecting the eastern territories to the California coast, and the arrival of the railroad had brought the usual assortment of enterprises that followed it. A hotel, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and the specific energy of a place that knows itself to be on the way to somewhere else. They would spend the night at the hotel and catch the westbound train the following morning. Naomi had enough money for a room, and Edwin had his wages, and between the two of them they were not wealthy, but they were not desperate either, which felt like a reasonable position from which to begin a new life. The hotel was a 2-story wooden building with a wide porch and rooms that were small but clean, which was all she asked of a room. The proprietor was a heavy-set man named Frank Oberlin, who gave her a sharp look when she and Edwin came in together and asked for 2 rooms, as if this arrangement was somehow suspicious. And she returned his look with the steady gaze of a woman who has stopped being concerned about what strangers think of her arrangements. They had dinner in the hotel's small dining room, which served a reasonable beef stew and corn bread that was only slightly stale, and they sat across from each other at a corner table and talked with the ease of 2 people who have spent enough Sunday afternoons in conversation to know how to do it well. But there was something different in the talking now, some new current running underneath it that had not been there before Tuesday morning when everything had still been theoretical. The feeling between them had been named. It was in the room with them, quiet and present. "Tell me about San Francisco," Edwin said. "What do you know about it?" "What Ruth has told me in her letters," Naomi said. "She says it is loud and crowded and alive in a way that nothing else is. She says you can see the bay from her house on clear days and that the fog comes in off the water in the evenings and makes everything cool and gray. She says there are Chinese neighborhoods and Italian restaurants and 100 languages spoken on any given block." She smiled at the thought of it. "She says it smells like the ocean." "Have you ever seen the ocean?" "No," she said. "Have you?" "Once. When I was 17, I rode down to the Gulf Coast with a friend of mine just to see it. I stood on the beach and looked out at all that water and felt very small and very alive at the same time." He looked at her across the table. "You are going to love it. You sound certain." "I am certain about a few things," he said, and the way he said it was not boastful but simply matter of fact, the tone of a man reporting observable truth. "You are going to love the ocean. San Francisco is going to suit you, and whatever comes next is going to be better than what we both left behind." She looked at him in the lamplight of the small dining room and thought that she had spent 3 years in the desert learning to be alone and finding that she was capable of it, which was important, but that being capable of solitude and preferring it were not the same thing. She thought that the Sunday afternoon coffees and the steadiness of him had been, if she was being fully honest with herself, the part of her life in Caldwell Flats that she would have been most sorry to lose. "Edwin," she said. "Yes. I want to say something that I did not say last night on the porch, because last night I was still sorting out what it was." He waited with the patience that was one of the most characteristic things about him. "When you said you were coming with me," she said, "something settled in me, not like a closing down but like a coming to rest, like finding the right elevation after a long climb." She looked at him steadily. "I do not know what we are yet. I know what I feel, but I am not a person who names things before they have had time to become what they are. I just wanted you to know that I feel it, whatever it is. I feel it clearly." The look he gave her was warm and certain and patient all at once. "That is enough for me," he said. "For now, that is more than enough." The train westbound from Maricopa Wells left at 8 in the morning, and Naomi stood on the platform in the early desert light and watched it approach from the east with a mixture of excitement and gravity that she did not try to resolve. The locomotive was enormous and loud, the sound of it arriving long before the actual machine came into view, and when it finally pulled into the station, it moved with the massive, indifferent confidence of something that does not concern itself with the smallness of the things around it. Calhoun, who had arrived at the station the previous evening via freight wagon, was loaded into the livestock car with considerable protest, but ultimately with success. Edwin spoke to the horse in a low, steady voice throughout the process, the same tone of calm authority he used in most situations that required it, and Calhoun eventually accepted the indignity of the situation with his characteristic stoicism. They settled into the passenger car, which was considerably more comfortable than the stagecoach had been, the seats upholstered in worn green velvet that had seen better days but still provided a reasonable amount of dignity. The car filled with a variety of travelers, a family with 4 children who ranged in age from approximately 2 to 10, and who immediately began investigating everything within their reach. A well-dressed man who opened a leather briefcase and did not look up from his papers for the entirety of the journey. Several miners heading back to California after stints in the Arizona copper fields. And a Mexican family who sat quietly in the rear and shared food from a cloth-wrapped bundle with the kind of quiet, practiced generosity of people who know how to make things last. As the train pulled out of Maricopa Wells and began its westward run, Naomi looked out the window and watched the desert unroll past her in the opposite direction from everything she had known. The saguaro cacti stood in their distinctive postures, arms raised, some of them 40 feet tall and hundreds of years old, and she thought about how they had been standing there long before Thomas had come to Arizona with his dreams, and long before she had followed him, and long before any of it. And they would stand there long after every current inhabitant of the territory was dust. And there was something in that thought that was not sad at all but actually rather freeing. Edwin fell asleep in the seat beside her about an hour into the journey, which did not surprise her. He had mentioned that he had not slept well the previous night, too many plans turning over in his mind, and she was glad he could rest. She watched his face in sleep and saw the tension that was always present in his waking expression dissolve into something younger and less defended, and she felt a tenderness toward him that was so straightforward and uncomplicated that it was almost startling after months of carefully complicating it in her own mind. She took out the letter from Ruth and read it again, her eyes moving over the familiar words. "Come to something better," Ruth had written. And Naomi thought, looking at the sleeping man beside her and the desert transforming slowly into different country as the miles accumulated, that she was already doing exactly that. The landscape changed as they moved west, the spare drama of the Sonoran Desert gradually giving way to different terrain. They passed through mountain grades where the train slowed and strained against the inclines, and the air through the windows grew cooler and carried the smell of pine. They crossed river valleys where cottonwoods stood along the banks in brilliant green, against the pale stone of the surrounding hills. The light was different at every hour, and Naomi watched it all with the attention of a woman who has learned not to take moving scenery for granted, because she has spent 3 years looking at the same view from the same window. Edwin woke when the train stopped at a station called Yuma, which sat on the Colorado River at the California border. He woke with immediate alertness, the way people who have spent time in uncertain country learn to wake, and sat up and looked around and then looked at her, and something softened in his expression in the specific way it did when he realized he was exactly where he meant to be. "How long was I asleep?" he asked. 3 hours, perhaps. You needed it." He stretched his long arms over his head and looked out the window at Yuma, which was a dusty, hot-looking town with the particular character of a border-crossing point, bustling and slightly edgy and very much aware of itself as a threshold. "California side next," he said. "California side next," she agreed. They crossed the Colorado River on a trestle bridge that was newer than it looked and emerged on the California side into the Mojave Desert, which proved to be a different kind of desert than Arizona, flatter, and in some stretches nearly featureless, enormous and alien in its emptiness. The family with the 4 children had gotten off at Yuma, and the car was quieter now, and Edwin and Naomi talked in the easy way they had developed over months of Sunday conversations, moving from one subject to another without agenda. He told her about the first cattle drive he had ever participated in, at the age of 20, when he had ridden up from Texas to Kansas with a crew of 14 men and several hundred head of longhorn cattle, and had understood for the first time what it meant to be genuinely responsible for something, to have a thing depend on your judgment and your endurance and your willingness to stay when staying was hard. She told him about her mother's last year, when the older woman had been ill and Naomi had been 17 and the primary caretaker, and how she had learned then that love was not a feeling but a practice, something you did every day whether or not you felt like it. "Is that a hard lesson?" he asked. "It was hard to learn," she said, "but it turned out to be one of the most useful things I know." "I think the same is true of most hard lessons," he said. The train ran through the long afternoon and into the early evening, and then the terrain began to change again, the desert broken by mountains and then coastal ranges, and the light took on a quality that was different from anything the desert offered, softer and more diffuse, filtered through marine air that was reaching inland from the Pacific. And then, as the train came through the last mountain pass and began its descent toward the coast, Naomi smelled something through the open window that stopped her mid-sentence. The ocean. She had never smelled it before, but she knew it instantly. Salt and depth and something alive and immense, nothing like the dry mineral smell of the Arizona desert. She turned to Edwin with an expression that she could not control and did not try to, wide open and delighted, and he saw it and smiled, and the smile was full and real and changed his face entirely. "There it is," he said. "I can smell it," she said, which she knew was not a sophisticated or articulate observation but was exactly what needed to be said. "Wait until you see it," he said. They arrived in San Francisco on a Tuesday evening in October of 1882, and the city met them the way Ruth's letters had described it, loud and various and alive in a way that was fundamentally different from anything the Arizona Territory had offered. The train station was enormous and echoing, and full of people moving in all directions with the purposeful energy of people who live in a city that does not slow down. The air was cool, dramatically cool after weeks of desert living, and the fog that Ruth had described was already beginning to drift in from the bay, softening the gas lamp lights along the street into globes of warm haze. Ruth was waiting on the platform, and Naomi saw her from a distance and felt something in her chest unlock that she had not known was locked. Ruth was 2 years older, taller, with their mother's nose and their father's eyes, and a warmth that was the defining quality of her character, the kind of warmth that makes people feel immediately that they have arrived somewhere safe. She opened her arms when she saw Naomi and held her with a fierceness that communicated everything the letters had tried to say and had not quite managed. "You are here," Ruth said, into Naomi's shoulder. "I am here," Naomi said back, and felt the truth of it settle. Ruth pulled back and looked at Edwin over Naomi's shoulder with the frank, assessing gaze of an older sister who has been informed by letter of a man's existence and is now meeting him in person and deciding in real time what she thinks of him. Edwin met her gaze with his customary steadiness, and whatever Ruth saw in that exchange seemed to satisfy her because her expression moved from assessment to something warmer. "Edwin Yates," she said. "Mrs. Crane," he said, and took off his hat. "Thank you for the invitation." "The invitation was for Naomi," Ruth said, with a directness that was clearly a family trait. "But I suspect the invitation extends to wherever Naomi goes, so you are welcome." She looked between the two of them with an expression that said she understood more than she had been told. "Come on, both of you. Philip has dinner waiting." Philip Crane was a quiet, solid man in his late 30s with a good handshake and the kind of careful attentiveness that makes a person feel seen without being examined. He welcomed Edwin into his home with the simple hospitality of a man who is genuinely glad of company, and he and Edwin found each other easily through the shared vocabulary of men who have done practical, physical work and understand that kind of life. The dinner was the best meal Naomi had eaten in years. Roast chicken and roasted potatoes and fresh bread, and a green salad that seemed almost miraculous after months of food that had been primarily about sustenance rather than pleasure. Ruth poured wine, which was something Naomi had almost forgotten existed, and the four of them sat around the Cranes' dining table and talked until the candles had burned low, and the fog outside the windows had thickened into something almost solid. In the weeks that followed, Naomi and Edwin settled into San Francisco with the mix of wonder and confusion that attends any significant displacement. The city was everything Ruth had promised and also several things she had not mentioned: the steepness of the hills, the way the fog could make an afternoon feel like evening and then lift suddenly to reveal extraordinary light, the sheer density and variety of the population, which included Chinese immigrants working in laundries and restaurants and construction, Irish immigrants who had come for the gold rush and stayed for the city, Mexican families who had been in California before California was American, freed Black Americans who had made their way west, and dozens of other origins and stories layered together in the specific, sometimes difficult, sometimes beautiful way of a city that has grown faster than its ability to accommodate everyone fairly. This was something Naomi paid attention to. She had grown up in a time when the inequities of American life were impossible to ignore if you were paying attention, and she paid attention. She saw the signs in windows that excluded certain people. She saw the neighborhoods where Chinese families were confined by law and custom to a specific geography. She saw the ways that the city's abundance was not equally distributed, and she felt the same discomfort she had always felt in the face of injustice, the particular kind of discomfort that comes from understanding that a problem exists and struggling to know what an individual person can do about it. Edwin saw it too. On an afternoon when they were walking through the city and had passed through several neighborhoods of different characters, he said, quietly, "The West was supposed to be the place where a man could start over clean, where your past did not follow you." He paused. "I think some people find that to be true. And some people find that the same problems followed them west on the same train they did." "My husband thought the territory was a place beyond the old rules," Naomi said. "He was wrong about the water rights, but he was also wrong about the fresh start. The old rules came along." "They always come along," Edwin said. "You have to keep pushing them back. That is the actual work." She looked at him as they walked through the San Francisco afternoon, this man who had left everything he knew to come with her, and she thought that his understanding of the world was one of the things she valued most about him. His refusal to simplify what was complicated, his willingness to look at difficulty directly. Edwin found work within the first 2 weeks. A stockyard on the southern edge of the city needed men who understood cattle, and his references from the rocking K and his evident competence were enough to get him a position quickly. He did not love the work the way he had loved working on the open land, but he adapted to it with his characteristic practicality, and the wages were fair, and the foreman was a reasonable man named Di Martino, who did not make unnecessary demands. Naomi began helping Philip with the account books, which turned out to suit her very well. She had always been good with numbers, a fact she had never had much occasion to use in Caldwell Flats, where the arithmetic of her laundry business was not complex. But Philip's dry goods operation had grown to the point where managing the accounts required genuine skill and attention, and she discovered in herself a real pleasure in the work, the satisfaction of bringing order to what had become slightly chaotic, of finding the patterns in the numbers and making sense of them. Ruth watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has arranged something well and knows it. She did not say, "I told you so," because she was not that kind of woman, but her expression on the evenings when the four of them sat together said something very close to it. Naomi and Edwin had been in San Francisco for almost 6 weeks when the evening arrived that changed the nature of things between them, not dramatically or suddenly, but with the quiet inevitability of something that has been heading in a direction for a long time and has finally arrived. They had gone together to watch the sun set over the bay, which was a thing Ruth had recommended, and which Naomi had been wanting to do since she arrived. They walked up one of the hills to a promontory that looked west over the water, and the sun went down over the Pacific in a display that bore no resemblance to an Arizona sunset, except in the fact of it being the same sun going down over the same world. Here the light fell on water, and the colors reflected and rippled and multiplied, and the fog was already drifting in from the Golden Gate, and the whole enormous sweep of the bay lay out below them in the last of the day's light. Naomi stood at the top of the hill and looked at all of it and felt something she recognized as happiness, specific and present and real, not the future happiness of plans and ambitions, but the immediate, undeniable happiness of a person standing in a place they want to be, next to a person they want to be with. Edwin stood close beside her, close enough that their arms were touching. He had taken off his hat and held it in one hand, and the wind off the bay lifted his dark hair, and he was looking at the water with an expression of complete absorption. Then he turned and looked at her, and she was already looking at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything because the thing that needed to be said was already being communicated entirely without words. "Naomi," he said. "Yes," she said, before he could say anything else, because she knew what was coming and she had known it was coming for 6 weeks, since the night on the porch and the conversation in the hotel dining room and the smell of the ocean through the train window, and all the moments between and after. He understood what yes meant. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly." He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes that were also, she had decided, the exact color of the bay in the evening light. "I have not got a ring," he said. "I have been in this city 6 weeks, and my savings are not what they should be for what I am about to ask. But I think if I wait until I have a ring I am going to find some other reason to wait after that, and I am done waiting." He held her gaze. "Will you marry me, Naomi Brooks? Will you let me be the person who gets to be next to you for the rest of whatever comes next? I am asking plainly because I do not know any other way to ask. I love you. I have loved you since sometime around the 4th or 5th Sunday afternoon on your porch in Caldwell Flats, and every day since has made me more certain of it. Will you have me?" She looked at him standing at the top of the hill with the bay spread out behind him and the fog coming in, and the last of the sun turning everything golden, and she thought about all the careful walls she had built around herself over 3 years of surviving, and she thought about how those walls had not kept her safe from loneliness, only from the thing that was the actual remedy for it, and she thought that a person could be careful and still be brave, and that she intended to be both from now on. "Yes," she said. I will have you, Edwin Yates. I will have you completely." He put his hat back on his head and took her face in both his hands and kissed her. And the fog came in around them, and the city spread out below them, and the bay went dark and silver and alive. And it was nothing like the movies that would not exist for another 40 years. And it was everything like love. They were married 6 weeks later, in December of 1882, in a ceremony at the small Methodist church 3 blocks from Ruth and Philip's house. It was not a large or elaborate wedding. Naomi wore her best dress, which was a blue-gray wool that Ruth had helped her alter to fit better, and she carried a small bunch of winter flowers that Ruth had arranged. Edwin wore a dark coat that he had bought at a second-hand establishment on Market Street, and which fit him better than it had any right to, given that he had not had it tailored. Ruth and Philip stood as witnesses. The minister was a cheerful young man named Pastor Holt, who had recently arrived from Vermont, and who conducted the ceremony with genuine warmth and only occasional reference to his notes. Edwin's voice did not waver when he made his vows, which she had known it would not. Her own voice was steadier than she expected it to be, which pleased her. When the minister pronounced them married and Edwin kissed her for the second time in her life, Ruth let out a sound that was partly a laugh and partly a sob and entirely characteristic. And Philip shook Edwin's hand with both of his own and told him he was a lucky man in a tone that meant it completely. They moved into a small rented house 4 blocks from the Cranes, which was far enough for privacy and close enough for the Sunday dinners that had become a fixture of all their weeks. The house had 2 bedrooms and a parlor, and a kitchen with a stove that was more modern than anything Naomi had cooked on in Arizona, and a small garden in the back where she discovered almost immediately that the San Francisco soil, fed by the fog, would grow things that the Arizona desert had never permitted. She grew tomatoes and herbs, and eventually a small apple tree that was already in the ground when they arrived and which produced, the following autumn, more apples than they could eat in a month. She gave some to Ruth and some to the family next door, the DeLucas, an Italian couple with a grandmother who spoke almost no English but who communicated her approval of Naomi with consistent gifts of bread, and the occasional cake left on the back step. Edwin, in the first year, moved from the stockyard to a better position, driving for a transport company that moved freight between the city and the farms and ranches of the surrounding countryside. He was on the road more than she would have preferred, but he always came home, and he always came home exactly as she had left him, which was a thing she had not known how to hope for until it became her reality. He was the same man at the end of every week that he had been at the beginning, constant in the way that mattered. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty. They learned each other's habits and tolerances and the specific ways their personalities pushed against each other, because even 2 people who are well-suited have edges that require accommodation. Edwin had a habit of going quiet when he was troubled rather than speaking about it, retreating into himself in a way that Naomi found difficult to reach across, until she learned that the proper response was not to push, but to simply be present and patient, and that he would eventually surface and speak. She had a tendency, when she was anxious, to become extremely organized in a way that was occasionally aggressive, reorganizing shelves and cleaning things that did not need cleaning, and he learned to recognize this as the external expression of an internal state, and to ask, gently, what was actually the matter. These were the negotiations of a real life shared between 2 real people, and Naomi found that she liked the work of it, the ongoing, daily work of being known by someone and knowing them in return. Thomas had been a dreamer, and she had loved his dream, but they had never quite achieved the daily intimacy of 2 people who have decided to fully let each other in. With Edwin, it was different. He was interested in her in the specific, particular way that has nothing to do with the idea of a person and everything to do with the actual person, and she found herself known in ways that felt, every time she noticed them, like a small miracle. In the spring of their 2nd year in San Francisco, Naomi discovered she was expecting their first child, a fact that she received with a mixture of joy and something that took her a moment to identify as the memory of hope, because she had hoped for children with Thomas, and it had not come about, and she had set that hope aside so carefully that she had almost forgotten she had done it. Edwin, when she told him, was so still for such a long moment that she began to wonder if she had miscalculated his desire for a family. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her into his arms with a care that was almost reverent, and she felt him breathe out against her hair, and he said very quietly, "I did not know I wanted this so much until you just told me." She laughed, muffled against his shoulder. "That is a strange thing to say." "It is an honest thing to say," he said. "I did not let myself think about it. But now that you have said it, I find I want it more than almost anything." Their son was born in November of 1884, a healthy, loud, emphatic arrival who announced himself to the world, with the kind of conviction that suggested he was not going to be the sort of person who undersells himself. Edwin was present for the birth, which was not entirely common for the time but which Naomi had stated clearly she wanted, and he held her hand through the long hours of labor and afterward sat with the baby in his arms by the window and looked at him with an expression of such complete and undefended love that Naomi, exhausted and spent, watched them from the bed and felt her heart do something that had no adequate description in language. They named him James, after Edwin's father, with Thomas as a middle name, because Naomi was a woman who did not erase her history but carried it forward transformed. Ruth and Philip came that evening, and Ruth held James with the practiced ease of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, and Philip stood next to Edwin, and the two men talked quietly in the corner in the way of men who are moved by something and are managing it through the medium of practical conversation, and Naomi lay in the bed and listened to all of it, and thought that this room, in this city, in this life she had chosen by deciding to leave another one, was the place she was meant to be. James grew in the specific, surprising way that children do, revealing himself gradually as a person with his own particular character, which turned out to be a combination of his father's patience and his mother's organizational instincts, with an added quality that belonged entirely to himself, a kind of cheerful intensity that made everything he was interested in seem extremely important and interesting. He was walking before his first birthday and talking in complete sentences before his second, and by the time he was 3, he was conducting daily inspections of the garden with the gravity of an assessor and bringing Naomi detailed reports on the state of the tomato plants. In the winter of 1886, Naomi and Edwin welcomed their second child, a daughter they named Clara Ruth, Clara for the neighbor in Caldwell Flats who had taken the hens with such appreciation, and Ruth for reasons that required no explanation. Clara was, from the beginning, a different sort of person than James, more watchful and more deliberate, with a quality of stillness that made adults want to know what she was thinking. She looked at the world with Edwin's gray-blue eyes and made up her mind about things quickly and quietly, and then acted on what she had decided without a great deal of drama. And Naomi recognized in this the shape of her own character and felt a kinship with her daughter that was deep and immediate. Edwin, with 2 children and a wife, and a life in San Francisco that had exceeded any expectation he had brought west with him, eventually moved from freight transport to a more settled position, managing a small warehouse on the Embarcadero, which allowed him to be home most evenings. He was good at the work, which required the same qualities he had always had: calm authority and practical intelligence, and the ability to earn the trust of people who had no particular reason to give it. He was respected by the men who worked for him, which he valued, and he came home at the end of each day still himself, which Naomi valued more than she could articulate except by the fact of showing it. They had been in San Francisco for 5 years when Edwin came home one evening with a quietness about him that she recognized, and she waited until after dinner and after James was in bed and Clara was nursing into sleep, and then she said, "Tell me what you are thinking about." He looked at her across the small parlor where they sat in the evenings when the children were settled, the room that had accumulated over 5 years, the specific texture of a life actively lived, books she had been reading and his boots by the door and a drawing James had made that she had pinned to the wall and a small arrangement of dried flowers from last summer's garden. He said, "I have been thinking about the rocking case." She waited. "Not about going back," he said quickly. "I am not thinking about going back to Caldwell Flats, but I have been thinking about land." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture she knew meant he was about to say something he had been working up to for a while. "There is land available north of the city, in the valley up through Marin and into Sonoma County. The soil up there is extraordinary, Naomi. I have been through it with the freight wagons and I have seen what it grows. There are men running cattle up there and men growing grapes and men growing everything that this climate and this soil will allow, which turns out to be a great deal." She looked at him steadily. "You want land," she said. "I want us to have land," he said. "I know San Francisco has been good to us. I know the city suits you better than I expected it to when we first arrived. But I think if we had land, something of our own, something that James and Clara would have when they are grown, something that is not just wages month to month but something actual and lasting, I think that would be worth working toward." She thought about the small garden behind the house and the apple tree and the tomatoes and the way she felt when she was in it, connected to something growing. She thought about the wide sky she had watched from a window in Arizona and the different sky over San Francisco, and the sky she had seen on the freight wagon runs that Edwin described, different again, open and blue over rolling hills and wild grass. She thought about James conducting his garden inspections and Clara's watchful eyes and the specific pleasure of a life that was being built rather than merely maintained. "Then let us work toward it," she said. And so they did, with the same quiet, determined practicality with which they had done everything else. Edwin continued his work at the warehouse and set aside a portion of every wage. Naomi expanded her accounting work, taking on 2 additional clients beyond Philip's business, a small restaurant and a law office that needed someone reliable and precise. They did not spend extravagantly, which was not difficult for either of them because neither of them had come from circumstances that encouraged extravagance, and they did not spend miserably either, because they understood that a life that is only about deferred pleasures becomes a life about deprivation rather than purpose. Ruth and Philip, when Edwin described the plan over one of the Sunday dinners, listened with the attention of people who take things seriously and then offered what help they could. Philip had connections in Sonoma County through his dry goods supply network, and he made introductions and provided information, and eventually, on a clear Saturday in the autumn of 1887, Edwin and Naomi drove north of the city with James, who was nearly 3, sitting between them on the wagon seat, and Clara in a basket in the back, and saw for the first time the land that would eventually be theirs. It was a morning when the fog had cleared early, and the hills were the deep, rich green of late autumn, and the oak trees stood in groups across the hillsides with the permanence of things that have been there long enough to belong. There was a creek running along the eastern edge of the property, and a stand of redwoods at the north end, and a view from the high point of the property that encompassed a sweep of valley and hills, and on very clear days, a distant glimmer that might have been the bay. Edwin stood on that high point with James on his shoulders and Clara in the crook of his arm and looked out at the valley, and Naomi stood beside him and felt the same thing she had felt on the hill above the bay on the evening he proposed, the sense of being exactly where she was meant to be. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. It took 2 more years of saving, and one loan from a bank that Philip's connections helped them secure on reasonable terms. And then in the spring of 1889, they bought the land and began building the house that would be their home for the rest of their lives. The house was not large, but it was well built, because Edwin did a significant portion of the work himself with the help of 2 men from the valley who were builders by trade. And because Naomi insisted, with the firm practicality that was one of her great gifts, that every board and every nail and every window frame be done correctly the first time so that they would not spend the next 10 years fixing what had been done wrong in haste. They moved into the house in the autumn of 1889, when James was nearly 5 and Clara was 3, and the four of them walked through the rooms on the first evening they were truly theirs with the wide-eyed wonder of people who have arrived at something they worked long and hard to reach, and are now standing inside it and finding it real. Edwin and Naomi raised cattle on the land, not the enormous herds of the Arizona cattle operations, but a manageable number suited to the size of their property and their capacity to care for them well. They kept hens, which was a thing that Naomi had missed since the days of her small flock in Caldwell Flats. They planted a kitchen garden that in the rich Sonoma soil grew with a productivity that still amazed her every summer. Edwin planted an orchard of apple trees and pear trees and 2 plum trees that Clara, for reasons that were never entirely clear, decided were her personal property, and defended from all perceived encroachment with a proprietary intensity that the whole family found entertaining. Calhoun, the bay gelding who had made the journey from Arizona to California, and who had adapted to city life with dignity and to country life with evident relief, lived to the considerable age of 26, which was remarkable for a horse, and which Edwin attributed to the quality of the Sonoma grass and what he called a philosophical outlook on life. When Calhoun finally died peacefully in his stall on a winter morning in 1891, Edwin sat with him for a long time before he came to tell Naomi, and she went out and sat with Edwin in the stall, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things do not require words. James and Clara grew up in the specific, irreplaceable way of children who have good land to run on and parents who take them seriously. James developed his father's love of the physical world, of things that could be fixed and built and grown, and spent his childhood following Edwin around the property with a tireless appetite for whatever practical knowledge was available. Clara read everything she could get her hands on, and Naomi drove her to the county library with a regularity that the librarian, a severe woman named Mrs. Patterson who thawed considerably over the years, eventually came to regard as one of the more reliable features of her professional life. Ruth and Philip came to the Sonoma house frequently, and they sat on the wide porch that ran along the south side of the house and watched the children playing in the yard and the hills going golden in the afternoon light. And the four of them talked about all the things that people who have built real lives and real friendships talk about, which is everything, which is nothing in particular, which is the irreplaceable texture of ongoing human intimacy. On an evening in the summer of 1893, when James was 8 and Clara was 6, and the house had been theirs for 4 years, and all the parts of the life they had built were working in the patient, imperfect, deeply satisfying way of things that have been put together with care, Naomi and Edwin sat on the south porch after the children were in bed, and the valley was settling into the blue dusk of a California evening, and the first stars were coming out over the ridge to the east. It was so similar in composition to the evening on her porch in Caldwell Flats a decade ago that she felt the echo of it, the way a familiar chord sounds different when played in a different key. The same 2 chairs. The last of the light, the beginning of something that would prove itself over time to be more durable than either of them had dared to hope when they were sitting in Caldwell Flats and she had not yet said, "Then come with me." "Edwin," she said. "Naomi," he said, the same way he always said her name, like it was a complete sentence. "Do you ever think about Caldwell Flats?" she asked. He considered this in his deliberate way. "Sometimes," he said. "Not often, do you?" "Sometimes," she said. "Not with grief. More with the feeling of looking at an old photograph, something that was real once and is completed now." He nodded. "That is the right word for it, completed." He looked out at the valley. "I think about what would have happened if you had not said come with me. I think about that version of things occasionally. What do you think happens in that version?" "I think I go back to the rocking K," he said, "and I work for George Kellerman for a few more years, and then maybe I move on somewhere else. And I think I am always looking for something I cannot quite name because I never understood that it was a person and not a place." She looked at him in the soft evening light. This man with the storm-colored eyes that had, over 11 years, become the most familiar sight in her world, more familiar than the hills around their house, or the pattern of the kitchen ceiling, or any other feature of the landscape of her daily life. He was 42 now, and there was gray at his temples and more lines around his eyes than there had been in Caldwell Flats, and he was more fully himself than she had ever seen him, as if all the years of being allowed to be exactly who he was had let him settle into his own character the way the land settled under cultivation, richer and more itself over time. "I am glad I said it," she said. "Come with me. I am glad every day that I said it." He reached across and took her hand, the same gesture he had made on the porch in Caldwell Flats a decade ago and had never in the years between stopped making. "So am I," he said. "There is not a day I am not glad." The valley went darker around them and the stars came out in earnest over the ridge, and somewhere down in the hollow an owl called once and was quiet. Inside the house, James and Clara were asleep in their rooms, and the house itself settled with the small sounds of a well-built structure doing what it was meant to do, and the apple orchard in the side yard was heavy with the fruit of another good year, and the cattle in the south pasture were still, and the creek was making its continuous, patient sound along the eastern edge of the land that belonged to them, that they had built something real upon, that would still be here after them, and carry the marks of what they had made it into. Naomi thought about Thomas and the territory and the laundry and the 3 years of careful surviving, and she thought about the letter from Ruth and the morning she had looked out the window at the healing blue sky and decided she was done, and she thought about Edwin Yates showing up on her doorstep with his hat in his hands, and she thought about the moment she had said, "Then come with me," without quite knowing yet what she was inviting, only knowing that whatever it was, she wanted it. And she thought about the stage and the train and the smell of the ocean and the hill above the bay and all the days since, the ones that were ordinary and the ones that were extraordinary and the ones that were difficult and the ones that were simply and completely good. She had left the territory for good. He had come with her, and everything that had happened since was the proof of what those decisions were worth. She looked at the first bright star over the ridge and thought that she had not, in the end, needed to be fearless. She had only needed to be willing, willing to leave, willing to say yes, willing to love a man who was steady and honest and who showed up, not in the dramatic way of the stories that would be told about the West, not with a gun and a horse and a legend, but in the quiet, irreplaceable daily way of someone who has decided that you are worth being where you are. "Edwin," she said again. "Yes, we have a good life." He tightened his hand around hers. "The best kind," he said, "the kind we made." The stars came out one by one above the Sonoma hills, and the valley was still. And inside the house the children slept their uncomplicated children's sleep. And out on the porch Edwin Yates held his wife's hand in the dark and felt, as he did at the end of every day in this life, he had followed a woman out of the Arizona territory to find that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, and that she was beside him. And that was all the answer he had ever needed to any of the questions the world had ever put to him. In the years that followed, the life they had built did what good lives do when they are properly tended. It deepened. James grew into a young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and by the time he was 15, he was a genuine help on the land, capable and hardworking, and possessed of a quiet dignity that made people trust him easily. Clara grew into a young woman with opinions so well formed and so clearly articulated that she occasionally left adults several decades her senior reconsidering positions they had held for years. She had, from the time she was 12, an interest in the law that Ruth encouraged with books, and Naomi encouraged with the pointed observation that the law was one of the places where a determined woman could do the most good. and Edwin encouraged by simply never suggesting, in any way, that there was anything she was not capable of. Ruth's health became a concern in the early 1890s, a persistent weakness that the doctors in San Francisco diagnosed with the vagueness that characterized medicine in that era, and which was ultimately the expression of a heart that worked less efficiently than it should. She managed it with the same warmth and practicality that characterized everything she did, refusing to be defined by it, and insisting on the Sunday dinners and the visits to Sonoma for as long as she was able. Philip became her most devoted caretaker without making a performance of it, and Naomi drove to the city to sit with her sister regularly, and the two women talked in the way that sisters who are also genuine friends talk, about everything that mattered and several things that did not. And Naomi was grateful for every one of those afternoons with a gratitude that she expressed by being fully present in each one. Ruth died in the winter of 1897, peacefully and at home, with Philip beside her and Naomi holding her hand. It was a loss that Naomi felt in the full, irreducible way that the loss of someone genuinely beloved is felt, a permanent subtraction from the world, a gap in the shape of everything that does not close but becomes, over time, a different kind of presence. She grieved her sister completely and without shame, which Edwin understood and supported with the patience and presence that were the specific gifts he brought to every difficulty she had ever faced. Philip sold the San Francisco house after Ruth's death and moved to Sacramento, where he had business connections. And though he and Naomi and Edwin maintained warm correspondence, the geography of their friendship changed, as the geography of things changes when the person who was its center is no longer in it. James married in 1903 a young woman named Helen from a neighboring Sonoma family, a solid, cheerful, capable person who walked into the family's life with the ease of someone who has always known how to belong to things. Clara, true to the direction she had been pointing since childhood, did not marry young. She went to San Francisco at 19 to study, living in a boarding house near the city college, and reading law with a practicing attorney who was unconventional enough to take a female student and progressive enough to treat her seriously. She would not, in that era, be admitted to the bar, but she became a legal clerk who was in practice more knowledgeable than half the attorneys she worked with, and she carved out a life in the city that was full and purposeful and entirely her own. And she came home to Sonoma for holidays and summers, and was one of the most complete and capable people anyone in the family knew. Edwin's 55th year was the first year he began to show the accumulated weight of a life of physical labor, not dramatically, but in the specific ways that the body keeps honest accounts. A knee that had been troubled for years became more consistently so. A shoulder that had been injured in a cattle incident a decade ago made its presence known more often in the cold months. He did not complain about any of this, which was characteristically Edwin, but Naomi noticed and adjusted the work of the property accordingly, taking on more management of the accounts and the supply arrangements and the scheduling, and letting him focus on the physical work that he could still do well rather than pushing into the territory of what was becoming difficult. She noticed, and she said so. "You do not have to do everything yourself," she told him one morning when she found him attempting to mend a fence section that James could have handled. "That is what James is here for. That is what we built this place together for." He looked at her with a slight expression of wounded dignity that she recognized as cover for the genuine vulnerability of a man who defined himself partly by his physical capability and was having to renegotiate that definition. "I'm not an old man yet," he said. "I did not say you were an old man," she said. "I said let James fix the fence." She paused. "You are 55 years old, Edwin. You worked cattle in the Arizona sun for 12 years before you came to California. If your knee is telling you something, it has earned the right to be heard." He looked at her for a moment, and then something relaxed in his expression, the particular relaxation of a man who knows when he has been out-argued by someone who loves him and is arguing in his interest. "It is just a fence," he said. "Everything important starts as just a thing," she said. "Come in and have coffee with me instead." He came in and had coffee with her instead, and James fixed the fence. And it was a completely ordinary morning that was also, in the way of ordinary mornings between people who have spent more than 20 years learning each other's depths, a moment of genuine love. Edwin Yates was 58 years old, and Naomi was 52 when they stood together at the edge of their orchard on an autumn afternoon and watched James and Helen's first child, a boy they had named Edwin James, after two grandfathers, crawl through the fallen leaves at the base of one of the apple trees with the concentrated determination of a child, discovering that the world is larger than it appeared when one was stationary. Young Edwin James looked up from his leaf investigation and found his grandfather watching him, and held the leaf up with the expression of someone who has made an important discovery and is informing the relevant authorities. Edwin Yates looked at the small face of his grandson and felt something that he had no particular name for except that it was large and clean and good, the feeling of a man who has lived a full life looking at the evidence that it will continue past him. "He has your eyes," Naomi said beside him. "He has your expression," Edwin said. "That is the look you get when you have discovered something and you are not sure whether to be pleased or alarmed about it." She laughed, and the laugh was the same laugh it had always been, the one that arrived when something struck her as genuinely funny rather than politely amusing, unguarded and real. And he loved it as much at 52 as he had the first time he heard it on a Sunday afternoon on a porch in a desert town a quarter-century ago. They walked back toward the house together through the orchard, their feet moving through the fallen leaves, the sky above them the particular blue of a California October afternoon, the hills going gold and amber around them, the creek making its perpetual sound along the eastern boundary of the land that was theirs, and that they had made into something worth leaving to the people who came after them. Inside the house, Helen was cooking dinner and the smell of it reached them through the open kitchen window, and somewhere inside James was talking to someone about something, and his voice had, Naomi noticed, developed over the years into a register that was almost identical to his father's, that same calm, certain quality that she had trusted from the first time she heard it. The things a person passes on without knowing they are passing them. She took Edwin's hand as they walked and he took hers and they walked through the orchard together in the late afternoon light of a good day at the end of a good life, and everything was exactly what it was meant to be, which is to say it was not perfect, because perfection is a different thing altogether and not what she had ever wanted, but it was complete, and it was real, and it was theirs. She had left the territory for good. He had come with her. And it had been, in every way that mattered, more than enough. It had been everything.